I used to work night security at an abandoned geriatric hospital just outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The building had been shut down for almost 10 years by the time I started there, but the county still kept guards on site because people kept breaking in. Most of the time, it was kids trying to film ghost hunting videos or homeless people looking for somewhere to sleep. It wasn't a fun job, but it paid steady, and the overnight shifts were quiet enough that I could listen to audiobooks and mind my own business. The hospital itself was big, 4 floors, plus a basement, and an older extension on the east side that used to house long-term elderly patients. That was the geriatrics wing. It was the creepiest part of the place, not because of anything supernatural, but because everything had been abandoned so fast. The walls still had faded family photos taped beside door frames. Some rooms had empty oxygen tanks in the corners. There were dozens of old wheelchairs scattered everywhere, but most had flat tires or broken footrests. The air always smelled like old dust and dry wood. My job was simple. Walk the halls twice per shift, make sure no one had broken in, and check the motion alarms placed near the entrances. 90% of the time, nothing happened. The other 10% was usually raccoons. The first time something felt off happened during my second month there. I was doing my usual patrol through the geriatrics wing. The whole wing was dark except for the emergency lights that still worked off the backup system. They weren't bright enough to see well, but they were enough to keep you from stumbling into something. I was walking past room 214 when I heard what I thought was the squeak of a wheelchair. It wasn't loud, more like a short, sharp drag, the kind you hear when someone shifts their weight in a chair. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing followed it, so I wrote it off. Told myself it was probably the building settling. Old buildings make weird noises all the time. But about 2 minutes later, right as I was passing 221, I heard it again. This time longer, a rolling sound followed by a slow stop. I froze. I wasn't scared yet, but I knew the hospital well enough to know that no wheelchairs in that wing were functional. I remember checking that hallway earlier during my first patrol. Every wheelchair I'd seen had dust so thick on the wheels you could leave fingerprints on them. I waited again. Silence. I figure I had a trespasser. Probably someone who found a working wheelchair elsewhere in the building and was messing around. It wouldn't have been the first time. Teenagers liked wheeling each other around like it was some kind of theme park ride. So I kept walking but paid more attention. I made it to the end of the hallway and started back down the next one, the one that looped parallel to the first. That's when I saw her, about 40 feet down, near the intersection where both hallways met. There was a woman sitting in a wheelchair. She was facing away from me, angled slightly toward one of the old nurses' stations. I could see her shoulder-length gray hair and a light-color hospital gown. I couldn't see her face. I stopped dead. There was no way anyone should have been in there. The county had cut access to the building except through the main lobby, and I was the only person who had the key. I looked around for signs of forced entry. Broken glass, pried doors, nothing. I stood there for maybe 5 seconds before I said, "Ma'am, you're not supposed to be here." She didn't move. I said it again, louder this time. Still nothing. I took a few steps forward carefully, because I didn't want to startle her or, worst case scenario, deal with someone mentally unstable who had wandered in from the street. I've had that happen at other sites. You have to stay calm. But when I got about halfway down the hall, she pushed the wheelchair slowly forward, just a few inches, and then turned down the other hallway out of sight. I broke into a brisk walk, not quite running, but close. When I reached the intersection and looked down the hall she turned into, the hallway was empty. It wasn't a long distance. She couldn't have gone far, not that fast, especially in a wheelchair. The only rooms nearby were 218, 219, and 220. All doorways were open. I checked each room. Nothing. No wheelchair. No woman. Nothing disturbed. Dust everywhere. It didn't add up. I even checked for drag marks on the dusty floor, expecting to see tracks. Not a single one. I sat down at the nurse's station for a minute to think. Part of me wondered if she had somehow slipped past me. But the second hallway dead-ended into a locked fire door that hadn't opened in years. I checked the lock. No scratches, no fresh marks. Nothing. I wrote the incident in my logbook, but not the part about her disappearing. I didn't want my supervisor thinking I was starting to imagine things. For a few nights, nothing happened. Then it picked back up. Every time it was the same pattern. I'd be walking the geriatrics wing. I'd turn a corner, and I'd see her at the far end of the hallway, always facing away from me, always in that same light gown, always in a wheelchair. And every time I tried to approach her, she'd move out of view just long enough for me to turn the corner and find nothing there. What threw me off wasn't the figure itself. It was the silence. The hospital floors were old linoleum that cracked and popped under even light pressure. A wheelchair should have made noise, wheels squeaking, metal shifting, something. But she always moved without sound except for that first night. I don't know why, but that detail bothered me the most. The moment things escalated started on a Thursday, around 2:40 in the morning. I was finishing my second patrol. I was tired and ready to sit down for a few minutes at the front desk. As I got near the elevators, I heard the rolling sound again, louder this time, like someone pushing a wheelchair faster than normal. It was coming from behind me, down the same hallway I had just walked. I turned around instantly. She was there again, but much closer this time, maybe 15 feet away. Same wheelchair, same gown, same gray hair. Only this time she was facing me. Her face wasn't terrifying or twisted or anything exaggerated. She just looked blank, completely blank. No anger, no sadness, nothing. But her eyes were open too wide, like someone trying to see something far away. Her head was slightly tilted, like she was trying to understand what I was doing. I said, "Ma'am, do you need help?" She didn't blink. I stepped forward slowly, trying not to panic. Right as I got within maybe 10 feet, the emergency lights flickered. Not enough to go dark, but enough for a few seconds of dimming. When they came back to normal brightness, she wasn't there. The hallway was empty. I paced the area for almost 20 minutes, trying to make sense of it. There were no doors she could have slipped through. No corners. Nothing. That's when I finally radioed my supervisor and said there was consistent, unauthorized movement in the geriatrics wing, and asked for another guard to be assigned the next night. He told me budgets were tight, and I'd have to stick it out. So I did. Over the next week, she appeared 4 more times. Each time she was closer, like she was paying attention to how far she could approach me before I reacted. I started to dread that wing. I'd rush through the patrols just to get them done. Everything came to a head 2 months later. It was around 3 a.m. I was walking my route, and just as I crossed the junction between the 2 longest hallways, I heard a sharp click behind me, like metal shifting. I turned around immediately. Every wheelchair in that hallway, maybe 8 or 9 of them, was now lined up in a row facing me. I hadn't heard a single one move. There was no way anyone could have done that without making noise. And I knew I had walked past them earlier. They had been scattered randomly like always. I backed up slowly, not taking my eyes off them. My heart was thumping hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't thinking about bravery or logic anymore. I was thinking about getting out of that wing without turning my back. Just as I stepped past the old nurse's station, I heard the rolling sound again, fast, directly behind me. I turned around. She was right there, arms limp at her sides, head tilted, eyes wide open. No expression, no sound. The wheelchair was so close to me that if I reached out I could have touched it. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It felt like minutes, but it was probably just a few seconds. Then, without moving her hands or shifting her body, the wheelchair slid back on its own, slow and steady, until she was about 10 feet away. Then it rolled backward around the corner and vanished. I left that wing immediately. I didn't run, but it was close. 2 days later I quit. I didn't give a long explanation. I just said the night shift wasn't a good fit anymore. They didn't ask questions. They were probably used to guards leaving suddenly. The hospital was finally torn down 18 months later. Someone sent me a local news clipping about it. In the article, one of the demolition workers mentioned they found an old patient record book hidden behind a wall in the geriatrics wing. It belonged to a woman who had been admitted for long-term care in the early 2000s. She used to wheel herself around the ward late at night because she couldn't sleep. She died alone in room 221, the same room I heard the first wheelchair sound from. The first night I worked the old St. Alban Memorial site, the roof door alarm went off twice within an hour. That building had been closed for years by then, long before I joined the private security company that handled the place. Nobody used it anymore except maintenance crews that came once every few months, and me, 2 nights a week, just to make sure nobody broke in. Most guards avoided that site because it sat on the edge of town, surrounded by a bunch of overgrown lots and empty service roads. But I didn't care. I needed extra shifts. The roof door was part of the old intensive care unit wing, a big rectangular section on the top floor that still had the original ICU rooms, glass doors, empty nursing stations, and storage closets. The whole building had no power except for the emergency system that kept the alarms and a few hallway lights active. Everything else was dead. That first night, when the alarm panel lit up red and beeped roof access open, I wasn't thinking about anything strange. In abandoned buildings, most alarms are false. Sensors fail, hinges loosen, weather changes pressure on the frame. So I grabbed my flashlight, signed the time in the logbook, and headed up the stairwell. The ICU floor was colder than the rest of the building. That place never held heat right because the windows were old and half cracked. Every time I walked through there, it felt like stepping into a place that had been sealed away from normal life. Even sound changed. My footsteps always felt too loud, like the whole floor was listening. When I got to the roof access door, it was closed, just like always. Steel door, heavy bar lock, no damage, no sign of anyone touching it. I pulled on the handle anyway. Solid, locked. I reset the alarm from the keypad and walked away thinking nothing of it. 25 minutes later, the panel beeped again. Same alarm, same door. I checked it again. Same thing. Closed, locked, no movement, no footprints in the dust on the floor. I was annoyed more than anything else, so when the supervisor texted me asking for the hourly update, I mentioned the roof alarm glitch. He said it was probably cold air messing with the sensor and told me to just log it and move on. That explanation worked on the first night. It didn't work later. For the first couple of weeks on that post, the roof alarm went off almost every shift. Sometimes once early in the night, sometimes right before I clocked out. I always checked it. I always found the door shut. Everything normal. Then it changed. The first difference happened on a Wednesday around 1:40 in the morning. I had already done my patrol an hour earlier. I had checked the ICU like usual, quiet, normal, empty. But when the alarm went off that night, I noticed something small as I walked up the last flight of stairs. The air smelled different. Not strong, but a little like old alcohol wipes. the kind hospitals use. I didn't think much of it until I reached the top and saw the door. It was open a crack, just a few inches. Not enough to swing on its own, not enough for wind to mess with it. And considering I locked that thing every shift, it shouldn't have been open at all. I stood still for a few seconds listening for movement. If someone had come inside, I would have heard their footsteps somewhere on the rooftop or stairwell, but it was quiet. I pushed the door fully open and stepped onto the roof. Cold air hit me hard, and the city lights from far away made the whole place look dim and washed out. The roof was flat with vents, ducts, and one covered generator unit. Nothing unusual. Nobody out there. I swept the place with my flashlight anyway. No footprints. No signs of anyone climbing up. For a roof access door to be opened, someone would have needed the inside handle, or they would have had to force it. Either way, there'd be marks or damage. But the door was clean. I went back in, shut it, locked it, and tried to convince myself I'd just forgotten to latch it earlier. I knew I hadn't. That was the first time I felt like something was off about that floor. Over the next couple of weeks, the door kept showing as open on the alarm panel. The difference now was that sometimes I'd arrive and find it still shut, and sometimes I'd find it cracked open again. There was no pattern, no timing, no obvious cause. What got to me the most were the noises. The first noise happened around 3 a.m. on a slow night where everything else in the building was dead quiet. I was sitting at the front desk when I heard a loud thump echo from the top floor, like something heavy dropped onto the roof. I jumped up thinking someone had broken in from above, but when I checked every corner of the ICU floor and then the roof, nothing was there. No loose tools, no fallen debris, no animals, no wind that strong, just silence. 2 nights later, I heard the same kind of thump, this time from further into the ICU wing, right above one of the old patient rooms. Again, nothing to explain it. As weeks passed, I also started finding small things out of place. A rolling stool that wasn't near the nurse's station anymore. A cabinet door open. A ceiling tile shifted. Nothing dramatic, but enough for me to know that something was interfering with the floor. The moment that really started messing with my head happened near the end of December. I was halfway through my patrol when the panel beeped again. Roof access open. I remember looking at the time, 2:09 a.m., and feeling a kind of tired irritation about having to walk all the way up again. When I reached the ICU floor, I saw the door cracked open the same way as before, but this time something else was different. There were wet footprints on the floor, bare footprints. A single trail leading from the roof door to the far end of the hallway. They weren't large. Looked like an adult, maybe small-sized. But what bothered me wasn't the size. It was that they were wet enough to leave a full print with each step. But when I touched the roof outside, it wasn't raining. The air was dry. No moisture anywhere. I followed the prints slowly, stepping alongside them. Every few feet, I checked over my shoulder. The hallway lights were dim and spaced far apart, so every 20 feet or so felt like stepping into a darker patch before the next light. The trail led straight down the hallway, then disappeared inside room 413, one of the old ICU patient rooms that still had its glass door intact. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. The prints stopped right inside the threshold like whoever made them walked in and then vanished. After I left that room, I called my supervisor for the first time and told him I thought someone had gained access to the roof and was entering through the door. I didn't mention the footprints. I knew how that would sound, but I told him enough to request another guard. He said they were short-staffed and to just document everything. So I did. Everything got worse after the new year. There were nights when I would hear footsteps above me in the ceiling, slow, steady steps, like someone pacing along a line of vents. It would always happen when I was in the ICU wing. Never below it. Never in the basement. Only there. Some nights I'd hear the roof door slam, as if someone had thrown it shut just moments before I arrived. But every time I rushed up, the hallway would be dead silent. The door shut, the lock intact. I started bringing my metal flashlight with a tighter grip. The night I almost quit happened around late January. The alarm had gone off 3 times already. I went up the stairs for the 4th time, annoyed, cold, and half convinced the sensor had finally just given up on life. The door was open wider than usual, maybe 10 inches. Enough for me to see that the hallway behind it was darker than normal. The emergency light above the roof access was out. That had never happened before. I raised my flashlight and squeezed through the gap. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. I don't know how else to explain it except to say the air wasn't normal. It wasn't colder or warmer. It just felt like the hallway was being breathed into by something that didn't belong there. Like the air in the room had shifted direction. I walked forward slowly. About 10 steps in, I saw someone standing at the end of the hallway, past the nurse's station. A person. A man, I think. I couldn't see clearly. He was standing still with his back to me, facing the wall, wearing a thin hospital gown that barely reached the knees. Bare feet, pale legs. I didn't move. My flashlight was pointed just ahead of him, enough to catch the edges of his gown. I said, "Sir, you can't be here." He didn't react. I took a slow step forward. The man stepped forward too. Not a flinch, not a turn. Just one single step further down the hall, away from me. I said again, "Sir, I need you to stop." He kept walking, slow, steady, not turning or acknowledging me. He stopped near the end of the hallway, right where the roof door was on the other side of the wall. Then he took a left turn and disappeared around the corner. I waited, listening for footsteps. Nothing. But the thing that broke me wasn't him walking away. It was when I turned the corner after him, and the hallway was empty. The only thing, there was a small trail of wet footprints leading to the roof door. They stopped right in front of it. No prints on the roof outside. No prints going the other direction. Just a line that ended at the threshold. I shut the door, locked it, and walked away without looking back. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my neck. I didn't finish the patrol. I didn't care. I sat at the front desk until sunrise. 2 weeks later, they moved me to a different site after another guard finally became available. I didn't argue. I walked out of that hospital for the last time and never looked up at the ICU windows again. The only reason I still think about that place is because of something that happened months later. I talked to one of the maintenance techs who used to deal with the old medical buildings. I asked him about St. Alban Memorial's ICU and the roof access problem. He told me something I didn't know. Years before the hospital shut down, a patient in the ICU had climbed out of bed one night, removed his gown, and walked barefoot to the roof door. A nurse found the door cracked open and footprints leading across the hall floor. By the time they reached the roof, he had already climbed the edge. He didn't survive. And the strange part, his room was the same one where the footprints had appeared during my shift. I worked security at an abandoned medical complex for almost 8 months. The place had 5 main buildings, but the only one I had to patrol regularly was the old surgical wing. That was the building everyone complained about. Even the daytime maintenance guys hated walking through it because half the interior was still intact from when the hospital shut down. Operating rooms with glass observation windows, surgical lights bolted to the ceiling, old rolling instrument trays, and rooms stacked with forgotten supplies. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Most nights were quiet. I walked my rounds every hour, checked doors, logged each section of the building, and made sure no one broke in. Homeless people, vandals, and teenagers trying to film ghost videos were common at other sites, but not here. Nobody wanted to sneak into that building. Too far from the road, too dark, too isolated. I didn't believe any of the stories other guards talked about. They always had something to say about the surgical wing, sounds, shadows, doors closing, weird reflections, stuff like that. I figured they were either trying to freak out the new guy or cover up the fact that they were skipping patrols. For the first month, nothing strange happened to me. I walked through the surgical department dozens of times with no issues. The hallways were long and tiled. Every sound echoed for too long, but that was just the acoustics. The operating rooms were cold and dusty. Some of the glass viewing panels were fogged from age. I always checked each room, logged it, and moved on. Everything stayed normal until the night I checked operating theater 6. Before that night, I never paid attention to the numbers on the doors. They all looked the same. 2 glass panels on each side, heavy metal door, old stickers with color codes. But on that night, when I stepped into the hallway, my radio crackled with static just as I passed theater 6. The static lasted only a second. I didn't think much of it until I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was colder than usual. My breath didn't fog up, but I could feel the temperature difference right away. And something was off with the lighting. One of the emergency bulbs high on the wall flickered every few seconds in a slow, steady rhythm. The other rooms never did that. The operating table in the center was slightly rotated from its usual angle. Maybe maintenance had moved it, but since no one else had been on the floor that day, it didn't make sense. I did a slow scan with my flashlight, checked behind the equipment, logged the time, and left. Nothing happened during the rest of my shift. The next night, the same thing happened. Radio static at the exact spot in the hallway, then the same cold feeling when I stepped into theater 6. The emergency bulb flickered again, but this time I noticed something else. When I walked around the table, I felt watched. Not by a person, but by the room itself. Like being in a place where something waits for you to look away. I finished the round quickly and moved on. By the end of that week, Theater 6 became the one place I hated entering. But things didn't start getting bad until early February. That night, I did my rounds as usual, but when I approached the hall where the operating rooms were, I noticed the door to Theater 6 was open. It had never been opened before. All the doors were left shut except when maintenance needed access. Even if someone had broken in, they wouldn't leave only that one door open. I stepped inside slowly, scanning the corners, checking behind the table, making sure nobody had climbed in through the ventilation system. The room was empty. I radioed the supervisor and let him know I had an unsecured door, but there was nothing else going on. He told me to log it, shut it, and keep checking the rest of the building. So I pulled the door shut until it latched and continued my patrol. 20 minutes later, I passed the hallway again. The door was open, not wide, just enough that I could see the dark outline of the room through the gap. I didn't open it all the way. I just nudged it with the flashlight and listened. The building was silent. No footsteps, no movement, no vibration from another door. I shut it again, harder this time. An hour later, when I came back through, it was open again. At that point, I figured the hydraulic closer or latch was worn, so I wrote up a maintenance request and stopped thinking about it. But the next night changed everything. I walked into the surgical hallway like always, and right as my foot hit the tile outside Theater 6, my flashlight cut out completely. It didn't flicker, it just went black. I checked the battery pack immediately, thinking I'd forgotten to recharge it. But the moment I stepped backward toward the previous hallway, the light snapped back on. I stepped forward again. It died again. There wasn't any electrical interference in that building strong enough to kill a flashlight like a switch. None of the other rooms caused problems. Only this one. I backed up, kept the hall light behind me, and pushed the door open with my foot. Inside, it was pitch black. That flickering emergency bulb wasn't working anymore. I aimed my flashlight into the room, even though it had stopped responding. It stayed off. I stood there for a good minute, debating whether I should even enter the room. My job required me to check it, but something in my gut told me not to. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. That was when I saw it for the first time. Across the room, behind the glass observation window, a dark shape stood pressed against the other side. A tall human shape. Not a shadow cast by my light, because the light wasn't working. Not a reflection. There were no lights behind me to cause one. It was just there. Still, directly facing the room. My body froze. For a second I thought maybe someone was inside the observation room behind the glass. But access to that side was sealed. All the doors were welded shut after the hospital closed. I started backing out, and the shape moved. Not fast, not dramatic. It just slightly shifted its head as if following my movement. I backed into the hallway and didn't take my eyes off the window. My flashlight snapped back to life as soon as I crossed the threshold. I pointed it at the glass. Nothing was there. Just dust. Just an empty room. I didn't finish the patrol that night. I checked the rest of the hospital from the main hallways and skipped every interior room. I wasn't proud of it, but I wasn't going to stand alone in a room where something watched me. I convinced myself it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Being alone too long. Being tired. That explanation lasted about 2 days. On the third night, I was doing a routine sweep when I heard something that made me stop cold. The unmistakable click of a camera shutter coming from inside Theater 6. Not a digital shutter. An old film-style one. A clean, mechanical click. I stepped closer. Another click. Then a third. I radioed the supervisor immediately and said I thought I had an intruder. He told me another guard would drive over to help, but he'd need at least 30 minutes to get there. He told me to wait and observe. I stood outside the room, listening. Another click, then the sound of something light moving across a surface. Maybe a rolling stool, maybe a tray. The air coming from the open doorway felt colder than last time. I should have waited for backup. That's what training says to do. But standing in the hallway listening to those clicks made me feel worse than going inside. I stepped through the door. The sound stopped instantly. No movement, no cameras, nothing disturbed on the floor. Just that still silence the room always seemed to hold. I pointed my light at the observation window again. The shape was back, closer this time, right behind the glass. It wasn't moving. It wasn't shifting. It was standing exactly in front of the window, as if waiting for me to look at it. I backed out of the room again, slowly. Flashlight shaking in my hand. The shape didn't fade or flicker. It stayed there until I crossed the doorway. Then, in less than a blink, it disappeared. Just gone. No sound. No motion. No transition. It was simply not there anymore. After that night, I didn't want to be assigned to that building anymore, but the company didn't have extra staff. I stayed because I needed the job, but every shift got worse. I started seeing the shape, not just in Theater 6, but in other rooms too. Sometimes behind windows. Sometimes standing near the edges of my vision. Always still. Always watching. Always in places no one had access to. The last night I worked there, I was walking past the observation hallway when I felt something shift behind me, like someone standing too close. When I turned around, the entire hallway behind me was empty, but every window lining the wall had a dark shape standing in it. Not one, not two. Every single glass panel had a tall shadow pressed against the other side, facing directly toward me. Same shape, same height, same still posture. I didn't move. I couldn't. My whole body locked up. Then all the shapes leaned forward at the same time. Not fast, not sudden, just a slow, steady tilt, like they were studying me more closely. That broke me. I ran. I didn't finish the patrol. I went straight to the front doors, got into my car, and drove out of that parking lot without even looking back at the building. The next morning, I told the supervisor I was done with that site. He didn't argue. He said other guards had issues there too, and moved me to a retail account closer to town.